to today's session. So, today we're going to be talking about something that has happened in the news recently that actually kind of disturbs me, but it's fairly a common occurrence, so we're going to talk about it. Alabama came out with a recent piece of legislation on the Board of Education putting forth this notion to make their biology textbooks include a little disclaimer basically telling students to doubt evolution. Now, I'm going to read verbatim what the actual disclaimer says, and we'll go from there. So, the disclaimer reads, "The theory of evolution by natural selection is a controversial theory that is included in this textbook. It is controversial because it states that natural selection provides the basis for modern scientific explanation for the diversity of living things. Since natural selection has been observed to play a role in influencing small changes in a population, it is assumed that it produces large changes, even though this has not been directly observed." So that is the actual direct disclaimer. When you hear that and you read that, it may not seem drastic or radical, and it may seem, oh, well, it's not saying doubt it like I said. But if you actually pay attention, that is exactly. Anyways, sorry, I had something come through. But it is. If when it's saying that it's assumed that it produces large changes and that it's not been directly observed, that in itself shows an ignorance to what evolution is, what natural selection says. It's you're not going to directly observe the process of a Homo sapien one day turning into a Homo whatever the next. It's not a one day thing, and for an ignorant for somebody to put that in a biological textbook, which is supposed to educate somebody, especially our children, no, that's sad. So what strikes me kind of weird is the ACLU chapter director Susan Watson commented on it, but her comment was a slight, I'm not going to say defense of Christians, but she blew it off more or less. Her quote was, "This is a thinly veiled attempt to open the door to religious fanatics who don't believe in evolution, climate change, or other scientifically based teaching in our schools." So the disclaimer was just to keep these evangelical uh, family members happy so that they would keep their kids in a public school, which is understandable. Coming from a evangelical household where I was pulled from a public school and put into a private school, I can certainly understand that argument. However, I, I in today's society, I don't think it's the same sort of thing. With the internet available to these kids, even though I understand that the parents are always going to have the ultimate influence at that age, introducing them to these concepts, you don't have to flag it by saying it's not been directly observed. What you need to do is educate them properly, and that way they're not having misconceptions about what they're trying to learn and understand, especially if they're quarreling with spirituality and faith with their education, which most people probably do. So, and this just to point this out, this is nothing new for Alabama, let alone the southern states in general. And what's sad is last year in 2015, one of the Republicans there, Mark Butler, introduced state legislation that would allow public school teachers to teach religions as a means, and I quote, "to encourage debate. If a student has a problem learning, he came from a monkey rather than an intelligent design." I mean, again, this shows the ultimate ignorance of what they're even trying to fault. Evolution doesn't even state that you directly came from a monkey. It's all based on ancestral ties. So putting it in that sort of direct misrepresentation shows either a total bias, which there obviously is, or a complete ignorance, which there also probably is. Moving on, the evolution topic is kind of interesting to me, and I say it's interesting because I mainly want to go. I'll skip ahead the poll numbers here. So we've had evolution since the 19th century. Thank you, Charles Darwin. And you would figure that by now, like most things in science, it does take a little bit of time for public opinion to sway, but that public opinion usually comes around. Evolution, that's not the case. So out of the Pew poll that was released in February this year, roughly 6 in 10, it was 62%, say humans evolved over time. However, this is an important distinction. Only half of them, it was 33%, expressed belief that humans and other living things evolved solely due to natural processes. So you're seeing this big struggle between what was our grandparents of no way in hell was there natural processes involved in any sort of evolving to, well, we evolved, but there was definitely it wasn't just natural processes. So, and more importantly, 25% of that 66% are confident enough to admit a supreme deity guided it. So that's pretty substantial in my opinion. Same survey found that 34% rejected evolution entirely, saying that humans and other living things have existed in their present form since the beginning of time. Go figure. Another important statistic that I want to throw out, while 98%, and this is just this statistic goes in correlation to people's perceptions of science. So it's not that people have changed their ideas, right? I mean, our generation has gradually started to accept evolution more, even if it's still a misguided form of acceptance. But here's where this misconception comes into play and is also escalated. 98% of scientists connected to the American Association for the Advancement of Science say they believe humans evolved over time. Only 2/3 of Americans overall perceive that scientists generally agree about evolution. There's a 2014 data sourced from the Pew Research that showed the general public who reject evolution are divided on whether the scientific consensus on the topic. 47% of them saying they agree that scientists agree on evolution, and 46% saying they don't. So they don't even understand what actual scientists believe. And again, coming from a evangelical household where I still maintain some ties to my evangelical parents, it is very true. Mainly, not just evolution, but climate change, anything that is science related, it has become a point of contention to where evangelical Protestants know they can't deny science almost anymore. All they can do is cling to the bits of science that they can hold some sort of factual ground to, and then just misrepresent everything else around it to fit their criteria. Because that's what they do. It's all in how you perceive. And so if you have a misperception, it's totally cool to struggle with evolution when you think that there are plenty of scientists out there that disagree with evolution, which there aren't. And of course, of all those that are likely to reject evolution, evangelical Protestants made up the majority of them in America. Go figure. 57% of them say the humans and other living things have always existed in their present form. So that's most evangelicals. Evangelicals, by the way, making up 62 million adults. 25.4% in America. The largest affiliation in America, American Christians. So, just so you know. And as of 2015, that number was on the rise. It had risen about 2 to 5 million with deviation error. So, it's rising. We'll get to that in a second. But going back to tie in this evolution thing and this fitting criteria, trying to make things fit your criteria. So not only has it been a struggle for evolution to gain acceptance in the common community, it was illegal at one point, and I feel like most people don't really realize that. But in the early 1900s, 1915, 1920, it was illegal. There were laws that popped up in the South in the Bible Belt, go figure, that had anti-evolution laws where you could not teach evolution. Um, it was actually there was an Arkansas law. It wasn't until 1968. And remember, at this point in time, I'm not going to get into this because this isn't on topic. But remember, during this time, between 1920 to 1950, the conservative right has a death grip on American culture. After World War II, between atheist Stalin or Mussolini, whichever one, between the atheist societies that were established and the communist societies that were established, Christianity got scared. They got rocked. And they started, that's why you see the addition of God into the Pledge of Allegiance and God we trust in the coins and the additional roles that religion took at that point to counter the other things. So by the time the 60s occur, when you have the other liberal shift that occurs, that's when you start seeing these anti-evolution laws finally start coming into the Supreme Court. 1968, Epperson versus Arkansas. And I am sad that it is Arkansas since I am from Arkansas. But the Supreme Court finally turned its attention to anti-evolution laws, and the case was involving the 1928 Arkansas law that made it a crime to teach evolution in a public school or at a state university for that matter. So even if you're getting your freaking college degree, you can't teach evolution, which is beyond me. So the state governments in the 20s were free to do their own policies for church-state issues. In 1947, this was overturned in the Supreme Court decision, Everson versus the Board of Education. The constitutional prohibition on religious establishment began to apply to state as well as federal after this, and so that's why 20 years later, roughly, you finally see the appeal in Arkansas. And I just want to point out that this was also boosted. In 1947, you have the Everson versus Board of Education. In the 60s, you have the liberal movement going on. But in the 60s, you also, in the late 50s hitting in the 60s, you have the movement of the space program and kind of the battle between the Soviet Union and the space program and ours. And science becomes a major vantage point, a major topic for the public. You see, as the space race starts to develop, more and more newspaper headlines come out that are more science prone. People are turning their attention to space, and it helped. So by the time you have 1968 Epperson versus Arkansas, you have the overturning of these ridiculous laws. And it wasn't just Arkansas. I mean, I'm just using that particular case because there was one in Louisiana. But of course, they didn't give up. So once you took away the idea of straight up banning and outlawing the teaching of evolution, Christian conservatives had to come up with another idea to kind of battle that ideology because they can't have a competing ideology. I mean, they can't. I mean, it's devil worship to them. So what they did was the idea of creation science starts to come into play, which is the forefather of intelligent design. So creation science was basically put forth popularized by the Genesis flood book, Morris and I forget who the other co-author was. And so after this Genesis flood book, that's when you start having the idea that, well, the earth isn't 6,000 years old. We realize that now. But the geological formations that you're talking about here with your science, yeah, the flood could do that too. The flood gives that a pretty good explanation. That thing over there that you explain with science, yeah, it fits our criteria as well here. So we're going to say that it's evidence for this. So what they started doing was they took evidence that science already had and either tweaked it, misrepresented it to make it fit their bill, or it naturally fit the bill. I mean, there were some cases where you can just naturally slide stuff in without having to tweak it. But so either way, they started playing gotcha with the evidence and tried to put their idea of a creation science in to kind of counterbalance this evolution that is now going to be taught in the public school system. 1982, Arkansas tries to put forth Arkansas is a law that's struck down by the federal district court. It's McLean versus the Arkansas Board of Education. They're basically using this idea called a Lemon test, which was based off a previous court decision called Lemon versus Kurtzman, where they establish what it is that defines the government action in the Establishment Clause with religion. So at what point is the government intervening unfairly on the idea of religious ideology? And so this Lemon test is for secular purposes, and you have to prove different things. You have to prove that it's a bona fide secular purpose that does not advance and inhibit religion, and it must not excessively entangle the government with religion. And if it fails one of those three parts, it violates the Establishment Clause. And so, of course, the creation science failed face forward with not science, because there is no science to it. You're not predicting anything. You're just using facts that are already existent to explain your crazy ideology. So it gets shot down. Happens in 1987 again, up into the 90s. Edwards versus a Gillard. And basically, it involved the treatment of the law. This one was Louisiana instead of Arkansas. Again, the South. I wish I could find one from the North. I wish I could, but I didn't. I didn't look for long. Don't get me wrong. It's not like I spent hours looking, but I looked for 5 to 10 minutes and I couldn't find one from the North. I didn't actually put a state in, so who knows. But anyways, it's all from the South, it seems to appear. But from the 90s forward, creation science has kind of been backburned to intelligent design. And intelligent design is now the main proponent that everybody pushes, and mainly due to irreducible complexity arguments and things like that. And to see a continual war waged on the idea of evolution and just science in general is really hurtful and really annoying. I don't understand it. If these people that are usually for this are always expressing their concern that their religious liberties are being tied upon, and if it were me, I would be very afraid to start having my religion taught in a school system, because I would be afraid that the liberal public school system, if I was a Protestant Christian, would drastically misrepresent my viewpoints and drastically liberalize my message. But I don't know. I guess they don't really feel that way. Either way, I just kind of wanted to bring everybody's bring this a lot. This is something that's kind of important to me. In conclusion, I'll go in a direction that kind of ties back into earlier. So I noted that evangelicals are rising. They've risen 2 to 5 million based off the Pew polls since 2007, which I find really odd, since it's the most I find it odd, but I can explain it. So unfortunately, whether most people really get this or not, but most evangelical Protestants especially, are saved before the age of 14. It's a fact. Not only has the Barna Research, which is the largest biblical research group there is, done studies that have found this, but multiple different research organizations have found it. The Pew poll has found it. There was a Barna Research group that found it. And then there was one more that I can't name off the top of my head. Either way, it falls between 30 to 60% of all evangelicals were saved before the age of 13 to 14. And past 14, your chances to receive salvation increases drastically as each year continues on. This also has to be kept in mind with another popular, well, I don't know how popular it is, with another important research trend. I won't say fact, I'll be nice. A research trend that shows the higher the education, and this is done by different meta-analysis, so I'm not just quoting one study here. The higher the education, the less the religiosity is. I mean, you're just not as religious if you're more educated. You're not. I mean, the superstitious you understand more, you explain more naturally. You don't rely on superstition as much. So I kind of understand why the adults may be a little bit fearful as to why evolution being taught in the classroom in light of that statistic. When you hear that the more educated your child is going to become, the less religious they're going to be, you're certainly going to want to throw religion at every point of education at that point to curb that effect. So, and I can tell you from a personal standpoint, I've been told that my college has corrupted my person. My education from my college has corrupted my person. And I was told that as a child, too, that it happens. So, I mean, it's a very common thought in evangelical society. But more importantly, it's imperative that we teach our kids properly. It's important that they have a science education that is not based on these radical, conservative, right-wing evangelicals trying to always infringe their religion upon secular society. And fortunately, I will see if I can put this graph up in the video. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to. But basically, the good news is that as time is going on, the generational differences in evangelicals is pretty substantial in comparison. I mean, I realize that I said it has grown, but it's still, compared to what it was, no. So the silent generation, which was from 1928 to 1945, it was 57% Protestant in America, in America. Boomers, 52%. Generation X, it dropped to 45%. The older millennials, which goes from 81 to 89, it's up to 38%. And then millennials in my bracket, 90 to 96, is 36%. So that's a 20% drop from 1945 to 1996. That's big. And that makes me happy. Well, to all those that have checked it out, I appreciate it. This is first podcast, so I will get better, I promise. Have a good one.